Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant Podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So, this is an unscheduled, non-emergency, really just because we dropped the ball. Ask Me Anything episode of the Dispatch Podcast. Of the Remnant Podcast. Sorry, I just got back from the dentist and I'm a little, a little disoriented. I know we had some listeners who wanted more notice. They're not on Twitter. We are going to figure out a way to do this procedure properly in the future so that our core audience actually gets a chance to ask questions. Because that seems like a fair thing. Adam, this morning was saying to me that we should consider really boosting up the AMA kind of thing, but also making it for members only. So, we are considering that as well. But this was just basically because I have to go to New York. We had a guest fall through. I couldn't record at the normal time because I had to go to the dentist because I had not been to the dentist in quite a while. I kind of feel a little bit like Tom Hanks in Castaway after finally getting back to civilization. I'm less mesmerized by light switches. But other than that, there's going to be some summer scheduling that's going to be a little complicated because of my travels and whatnot, but we'll figure it all out. All right. So with all that out of the way and none of it being particularly interesting, in that spirit, let me bring in Guy.
Every now and then I do. It's funny you mentioned going to the dentist. Every now and then I do still get notes about, or I can't tell if they're joking or not. I would guess a lot of them aren't. Requests for you to record a podcast high. So if they put you under or gave you some kind of anesthetic, this is a approximation of that for people to see what it would be like.
No, I mean, nothing that exciting.
Oh, that's a shame.
I thought you were going to say, since you're from England, what's a dentist?
I'm just assuming.
Yeah, I don't think me doing a podcast high makes a lot of sense. I'm not saying I've never smoked weed because I've smoked weed, but it's been a very long time. And one of the reasons I stopped doing it is because I didn't enjoy it. I got very paranoid. I got very antisocial. My preferred way of
as opposed to how you normally are.
No, that's true. But that's fair. I think it brings out certain aspects of yourself. Right. I just, the only way I would enjoy it is like being alone, which is just not a great sort of relationship with a mind altering substance to begin with. And me doing a podcast stoned would be just a terrible idea because I would probably talk for like an hour of how every time you hear a creak in your house, if you sped up the tape of that would be the sound of your house collapsing. Because that's the thing I used to obsess about.
Really?
Yeah. And
did that stem from anything in particular?
No, it's just like I was like, you heard these creaks and like you had a recording of it, you could do time lapse recording and you sped it up, those creaks would intensify, and eventually, because of the laws of the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, just the house would collapse. And I thought this was the most brilliant insight conceivable. And I now think it's utterly banal and probably not true, but like no one wants to hear me talk out loud about that really slowly on a podcast. So anyway,
people do want to hear the solo podcast, though. Evidently,
that's true. Guy. I mean, once again, the judgment of our audience is superior to you.
That's true. That's why I'm stuck down here in the dingy 100-degree basement.
Of AEI, we should say.
Of AEI.
Yeah, just so listeners know we're breaking a lot of fourth walls here. Guys at the office, and for some reason the AC is not penetrating into the recording studio. So he's already kind of seems like a minor character from Cool Hand Luke.
I like to think that whoever was in here beforehand knew I was coming in next and just did that deliberately. As a form of punishment, or that it was you, or that you instructed the intern to do it.
I would like to think I'm capable of that. Cool Hand Luke, by the way, is by consensus. It doesn't have to be the winner, but it's up there. It was in a episode of Cheers 35 years ago when they were debating what the sweatiest movie of all time was, which became a regular G-File topic back in the early days. Cool Hand Luke was the dispositive winner. I'm not sure that's actually true, but it's definitely got to be up there. Have you ever seen Cool Hand Luke?
Yeah, a long time ago. I can't remember if I know we've talked about this. I can't remember if it was on the air, but Do the Right Thing. There's an ultra sweaty one.
Yes, that's a very sweaty movie. Yeah.
Trying to think of other examples.
There's a movie called Barton Fink.
Oh yeah,
which is not sweating all the time, but when they're sweating, it's very, very aggressive. I think there's a Roy Scheider movie called, I want to say, Merlin, where he has to drive a truck of poorly packed, I'm not making this up, a truck of poorly packed nitroglycerin through some sort of Brazilian rainforest or Ecuadorian or Honduran or whatever rainforest on like bad roads. And there's a lot of sweat in that. I also used to always debate with Tevi Troy and some of these other guys. I got to talk about Tevi in a second, but what movies had the fewest women in them?
Oh boy,
as a ratio to men, and I remember that what started the conversation was there's this terrible movie called, I want to say The Island with Ray Liotta, definitely Ray Liotta, where he's sent to some sort of penal colony island, and it's like he has to kill everybody and fight, and it's really dumb, at least as memory serves. And there were like no women in it, and this sparked. We left the theater and we're like, "Gosh, there were no women in that movie," or maybe there was one female voice, whatever. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is one, we got to fill time, but two, I was rewatching for the 8,000th time, The Great Escape, and if you're going to go on a graph where you're talking about quality of male actors and quantity of male actors as a ratio of female actors, yeah, there's some crowd scenes at the end when like the escapees are running through like these German towns that there are women in the background, but for the most part, there's just no chicks in that movie. It's pretty impressive.
So I just Googled movies with no female characters because this podcast has sunk to a new low. The first one that comes up is The Thing, which never would have crossed my mind.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
It's right.
Also, we don't know the gender of the alien, so that's not necessarily right. But yes, that's
that's
point.
True.
Yeah,
it's true. That's an interesting. That's one I never would have thought of. There's probably a bunch like that.
Yeah,
Glenn Ross is another one. That's funny.
I guess that's right. Is there no spouse? There's no wife at one of the home visits or anything? Anyway, it's a good one.
Listeners can look into this.
Pretty much all submarine movies, right? Prior to the 1990s, are going to be all male. Sure, I'm going to hear from somebody saying, "Well, what about it?" I don't remember if Ice Station Zebra had a gratuitous, wayward female who just happened to be in the Arctic. But
all I know about Ice Station Zebra is that's the one that Howard Hughes watched about 1,000 times on an endless loop when he was insane in Las Vegas. Yes, I believe so.
All right, so we've really covered the gamut. Have you been to any? have you been to any Kiss concerts or Kiss reenactment societies?
None lately. The next few are lined up for the end of the year, and I'm not sure if there will be any before that, although there probably will be next year. Because the concerts of the end of the year are allegedly the final concerts ever. Will that be the case? Probably not, unless they all die. But time will tell. I did, and I take it I should still not say his name, but I did recently have lunch with the mysterious, high-profile Kiss fan that you referenced last time.
Did you really?
I did.
Yeah. How'd it go?
And we went out for Japanese, and we talked pretty much exclusively about the Kiss cruise for the entire duration of the lunch.
Fascinating.
And he was endlessly fascinated by it.
Because he wants to go, but he just can't be seen going, right? That's the gist of it?
More or less, yes. And he kept asking, so was it, I think the kind of try and justify not going to himself. So it was, did you ever regret your decision while you were on it? Did you ever feel humiliated or question what you were doing with your life while you were on board? And I had to tell him, no, you're missing out.
Well, Yeah, it's also like you're 20 something, so like you shouldn't feel any of those feelings about almost anything that you do. But
Well, that's quite true.
um all right, we should have some substance in this thing before people
Should
just
we?
yeah, like people yell at me when there's no substance. They're like, "Why did I waste my time to listen to you waste your time?" And I think that's a fair
They're going
point.
to listen to the next one anyway, so what difference does it make? We should
No,
do.
we should respect the listener. Frankly, I would say if you haven't listened to the Brett Devereaux one, everyone should just go re-listen to that or listen to it for the first time because I really loved that stuff, and I wish I could have kept him on for another hour. And there's all sorts of pop culture stuff that we didn't get into, and all sorts of Roman and Greek history stuff that I wanted to get into that I planned to get into and then didn't get into. But we covered a lot of ground. I thought it was great. Um, anyway, so what questions do you have for me, Mr. Denton?
Well, the obvious starting point I thought was a few people requested a Dingo update, which I'm assuming enough time has passed now since you originally talked about it for you to give.
Yeah, so the dingo, aka the white trash swamp dog, she does not have a cardiac problem. We took her to, I say we in the imperial we, my wife did it because I had all sorts of conflicts, to a cardiologist, a specialist. Um, all you have to do, anyone who's had dogs with serious problems knows that just saying the word canine cardiologist costs you money. You don't even actually have to go. It's just all of a sudden you see on your credit card statement, you uttered the phrase canine cardiologist. That'll be $49.95. I mean, anyway, so it cost some money, but they were great apparently. And my wife says that she thinks that the reason why the vet at the normal place thought she might have fluid around her heart is one, she has this big lump on her back, which we can't do anything about. But two, apparently Zoe has unprecedentedly thick muscles in her chest, which she was just incredibly impressed by. And so, like, if you didn't realize that and you were listening, you might have mistaken it for a muffled sound or something like that. But anyway, they did an echocardiogram, cha-ching, and this thing-ogram, cha-chang. I mean, there's like adding up all the costs of all of these things. And she's still a little off her game. She's still a little loopy. She can't really add up small columns of single-digit numbers too well. But they can't find anything wrong with her. It may just be allergies or something like that. But all in all, we were really, really relieved, and there's no obvious reason to worry about her health right now. It's just that she just still does seem a little off her game, a little less interested in putting in the effort to kill small woodland creatures and the kind of things that really normally bring her joy in life.
And the rest of the animals are fine, I assume.
Yeah, Gracie's just old. I mean, Gracie's an old cat, and given how much my dog, I mean, I love that cat. I admit it. I don't like saying those words, but I do. I think she's a fantastic cat, but my daughter is so unbelievably invested in that cat that we might have to clone her and age her, and if she ever passed, and not tell my daughter, because it would be devastating for my daughter, and that we live in utter terror of something happening to that cat just because of how much my daughter loves that cat, and my daughter's like invested her childhood in that cat, and like so we must keep that cat alive at all costs. But so far, I mean, she's Rubenesque. I don't want to fat shame, but she's also, I don't know, she's got to be 13 years old, 14 years old, and cats can live a long time, but there you have it. So
someone did ask if we would have a cat expert on at some point, to complement the dog experts and the rat experts.
I wanted to. Ross Douthat's better half wrote a book called The Line in the Living Room about cats.
Oh yeah, that's right.
And
yeah.
I kept meaning to have her on or ask her to come on, and things got carried away and whatnot. So maybe we should look into doing that.
I have been trying to find a suitable dog genetics expert and rat genetics expert. And especially with the rat people, you have a limited pool already.
Mm-hmm.
And then the size of the pool is further diminished by how many of these rat people are A, willing to and capable of talking,
Yeah.
and B, are willing to and capable of talking on this show
Yeah, for sure.
specifically.
Yeah, no, I get it.
It's been great fun.
Rodentologists are famously terrified of pseudo-intellectual demi-Jews from the Upper West Side of Manhattan.
There's no overlap there at all,
Yeah.
I've been told.
Well, keep on it. I mean, the dog thing we can figure out, right? I mean, like it's there are dog geneticists that we can get, but I just have more rat questions. That's all. So,
a few people asked how you manage your time and if you take any approach to scheduling your work each day. Which someone specifically says, how do you manage to catch up on all the movies, streaming series, contemporary articles and books, and also write your columns, help run the dispatch while attending to the whims of those demanding quadrupeds?
Poorly.
I was holding that in the entire time.
When it comes to writing, what I need is, I don't need necessarily a lot of time, but I need a lot of runway, right? I can't commit to writing something if I know in 45 minutes I got to get up and go do something else. And so it's one of the reasons I almost never do lunch, because it just blows up my day. And that, and not wanting to talk to the people. And so having set times for things, that's why we sort of have set times to record the podcast and stuff, is I can plan around it. It's the thing that really screws me up is like a lot of the CNN stuff, and before that Fox stuff, where you get asked on really short notice to go do something, and their attitude is, first of all, they're paying you, so you should do it, but two, it's really not that big a time chunk. But for me, it's a huge time chunk, because it's not only just the getting there, it's the thinking about it, the getting back, and the interruption to the sort of writing stuff. I talk to Steve a lot on the phone, too much, although it's been a nice break of late. But no, I'm not good at this.
Couples therapy is working out for you guys?
Yeah. It's a lot of this stuff for me is just muscle memory, insofar as I've done this for so long. I've said this a million times. It's like one of the things that really sort of the pandemic really revealed for me is that I had already largely designed my life as if there was a pandemic already. And so, like, people used to look at me like I was the weirdest dude in the world writing in my car. And that's writing WRITING, composing in my car. And then, like, with the pandemic, all of a sudden became like socially responsible. And so I really have no very good advice other than get up early. I used to be a late night guy, and now I've been an early morning guy forever. Once it dawned on me that my brain was better for the first hour of the morning than it was for the last 5 hours of the day. I sort of, if I'm working on a magazine piece, which I don't do very much these days, but I used to have to write 1 or 2 magazine pieces a month for NR, plus all the G files and all the syndicated columns and all that kind of stuff. And even if the magazine piece was due the next day, I would always, if I was stuck, I wouldn't try and force it. I would just put it to bed and wake up at 4 a.m. or 5 a.m, and all of a sudden everything would be fine and easy. I got this advice a long time ago, is that the only part of the day you ever control is the morning. In the afternoon, the day controls you. And I think that's true. It's probably more true for business people, straight up business people, lawyers, and that kind of thing, than it is for someone like me. But it's sort of become a mantra in my life. And other than that, I really have no good advice or explanation for how I do what I do. everyone keeps telling me how hard I work, and it doesn't always. Sometimes it really feels like I'm working hard, but a lot of the time I'm like, what? I just had to write the G file and get the syndicated column done and do a podcast. What's, to me, it's not. I just had a dental hygienist working on me for an hour, and like that seems like a lot more work than the stuff that I do. It reminds me, there was this great episode, one of my favorite episodes of Community. Do you ever watch Community?
Yeah, I did. I used to love it.
Yeah, the first couple seasons are just so friggin' good. There's a great episode where it's a send up of the Law and Order franchise.
Oh, that's right.
And
yeah.
the opening scene, in Law and Order, at least in the old days, was always, two normal people, two normal New Yorkers discovering a body. And in the Community, it's them discovering a destroyed yam for a science experiment. But there's this great thing. You have to listen to it from the very first second it starts, where this one janitor says to the other janitor, dude, you got to stop hitting on your dental hygienist. And he responds, hey, she's the one putting her hands in my mouth. Which I don't
remember that.
The greatest line. I did not hit on my dental hygienist this morning. Anyway, back to substance.
That's when we missed last time. I remember talking about shows that went off that were extremely good and then just fell off a cliff and never really recovered.
I don't know that a Community fell off a cliff. Like, those are fighting words with my wife and daughter, because they loved it for a long, long time. It just got really trippy towards the end, and different. And I got to say, like, I loved Brooklyn Nine-Nine for the first couple of seasons. And then because it was running up against, like, I don't know if it was George Floyd, but those kinds of issues were all of a sudden to be like a hipster progressive New York kind of show and be pro cop was problematic. And we gave up watching for a little while because it was just taking itself way too seriously and getting annoying. And I just assumed it fizzled and died that way. But it's been rerun on Comedy Central. And it looks like they kind of shook it off like the last season and a half. They kind of realized, okay, we've checked that box, or that was killing us. Let's get back to being a funny show. And that's kind of rare for a show to like self-correct and get better at the end, which is probably a good glop topic as well. So,
a listener asks, you've alluded to an NRO like corner-like space on the Dispatch. Any further update on that? Will or could it ever happen? Or has Steve stepped in and squashed the idea for good?
He's not squashed the idea for good. The good thing about being a co-founder of the Dispatch is that we have the equal number of shares in the Dispatch, and he cannot, in fact, kill anything. There's no such thing as a truly lost cause at the Dispatch, because there's no such thing as a truly won cause, to paraphrase T.S. Eliot. And I know Brother Cottagio is down. So is Kevin Williamson. David French, were he not dead to me, was in favor. Steve's not opposed per se, but he's so reluctant about it that it will actually, and there's so many other things on our plate right now that we're trying to get online, that for us to stand it up and get it running, I would have to take lead and kind of Bigfoot over Steve and just say, I'm doing this. And negotiations haven't broken down to that level yet. So I'm thinking that maybe in 2024, I'll just, I'm thinking out loud here, with the heightened interest in the presidential campaign and, of course, the exploding civil war in Russia, that I'll be able to say, hey, let's do it as a temporary basis, see how it goes, and maybe get the camel's nose under the tent that way. But the dream is not dead. I still would like to do it. As weird as it may sound to people who think I write way too much, I often feel like, gosh, I wish I had an opportunity to blog. It's real. It's like a phantom limb problem for me, and there's just a lot of it. I think it in some ways it hurts the G file, because I end up, when I'm running the G file, I always talk about how I want to do it more bloggy style. It doesn't work, and I end up getting kind of ponderous, going too long on a single subject. Anyway, enough of my gripes. But yes, the group blog like thing is not a dead letter. It just negotiations continue apace.
Should probably do some punditry adjacent questions to address some topics of actual intellectual substance. A few listeners ask for your thoughts on the evolving Hunter Biden. Evolving is one word for it. Hunter Biden scandal and its ramifications for politics and American law and governance. Could you elaborate?
Sure. I'm not deep in the weeds on the Hunter Biden stuff. And I don't trust a lot of the people who claim to be. I'm not saying they're wrong or they're lying. It's just it has the feel of like when a news story gets to the point where I don't know what people are talking about, because they're so, fifth paragraph into their theories of something that they don't know how to bring people along. You kind of think, okay, this is a snipe hunt on the right, that is not going to bear fruit. I don't think that that is this. My point is that I think a lot of people, they've been so obsessed with Hunter for so long, basically ever since the laptop story, that they don't know that there are audiences out there that haven't really clued into this, and they're only really now hearing about the Hunter Biden stuff. So there was a story yesterday that this second whistleblower from the IRS claims that Weiss, I can't remember his first name, who was the district attorney or the U.S. attorney who was handling the Hunter Biden case, was blocked from was not allowed to actually prosecute what he wanted to prosecute. The way it was unfolding yesterday made it sound like this was a fatwa that was issued by Biden or Merrick Garland. I'm now seeing stuff. There's a thing in the New York Times that it may be more convoluted than that it was that Weiss reached out to U.S. attorneys in different jurisdictions where the crimes were committed and recommended that they prosecute those crimes there. And those guys passed, which is different than, which is not great, Bob, but it's not Weiss wasn't allowed to prosecute. It's that Weiss tried to get other people to prosecute and they used their discretion to pass. And I don't know what the final truth is. For all I know, as we speak, there's some other giant shoe to drop. But it is, I mean, we've talked about this on the Dispatch podcast. It is obvious to me that Hunter Biden is profoundly corrupt, and pretty much according to almost any standard, right? So not just like business corrupt or politically corrupt, but morally corrupt. And look, maybe we all believe in redemption. Maybe he's doing better now and all that kind of stuff. Though every time I see one of these interviews with him, he doesn't seem like a man who has really repented of his wayward ways. So regardless, the question is how much of this goes to Biden. And at this point, I'm fairly convinced that like it's a legitimate story. It's a legitimate investigation. I wish it wasn't Jim Jordan in that crowd handling it. And but it seems to me that there are enough people in the mainstream media who realize, this really does kind of stink. And there are enough people in the Biden family who've gotten rich off of this shady stuff. Like for one, I still very much doubt, this Hunter Biden text where he says, I'm sitting across from my father and I want to know where our money is, or whatever that thing is. Right. And we will reap vengeance upon thee for 7 generations if you don't wire my bank in Zurich immediately, or whatever the hell he says, like, whatever that is. It's entirely possible that his dad was in the room, but his dad might have been watching football and Hunter's sitting there on the couch, pecking away. I don't think it's inconceivable or even that much of a stretch to think that Joe Biden is a conventionally corrupt politician. He's enough of a ward healing, sort of old style machine politics kind of guy who grew up at a time and in a state where the occasional backsheesh or back scratching or whatever was pretty common. And I think he's kind of a loon, but he's not so dumb that he would do it in the way that Hunter does it. Right. So the idea that he would flat out ask for a bribe strikes me as really unlikely, not because I have such a high esteem of his moral character, but because I have sufficient respect for how these things are done by people who know how to hide them. And I'm not saying that he did it. I'm just saying it's plausible in the same way that I think it was plausible for Trump to want to collude with Russia, to do all sorts of bad things, because Trump has the sufficiently low moral character to do all sorts of stupid things. But it is outrageous. Let's put it this way. Even if Hunter acted completely alone and that Hunter is largely innocent of everything other than the things that he was actually indicted for or charged with in this plea thing, to bring him to the state dinner the next night is outrageous and insulting. And like in the old days, Jimmy Carter, if Billy Carter had just got a plea deal for lying about being coked out when he was filling out gun background checks, and for tax fraud, Jimmy Carter would not bring Billy Carter to the state visit from Chow En Lai the next day. I mean, it wouldn't happen. And Ronald Reagan wouldn't do that. Even Bill Clinton with his dubious brother, or Tony Rodham, who was even more dubious, who was Hillary's brother. They wouldn't necessarily have done that. I mean, at least when they brought scuzzy donors and other people in and put them in the Lincoln bedroom, they didn't put it on TV. So I just think it looks really bad. And I think that Biden, partly because of the old age thing, partly because they need people he trusts in his inner circle, and partly as sort of an FU to kind of troll Republicans and make them crazier and crazier. They think that this is a smart strategy. I just think they're kind of playing with fire. And I still think it insults the intelligence to think that Hunter Biden's artwork, people forget, the deal where Hunter Biden had some finger painting or whatever that he was selling out of some art gallery where anonymous buyers could spend $500,000 or $250,000 on some crappy art. The idea that was an ethical way of behaving, when really it's just like, it's a really clever form of, and for a novel, of like a way to like launder money for influence peddling or something. But the whole thing is just really shady. Why did the Biden family keep creating these LLCs? Why does everyone in the Biden family sort of in this specific kind of business? Again, it's mostly just smoke now, but like the smoke's coming from somewhere.
Two listeners asked two separate but similar questions about the Supreme Court. One asked, what are your views on the merits of or downsides of the Supreme Court implementing a code of ethics? And another listener asked essentially the same question about implementing term limits in the Supreme Court.
On the ethics thing, I got no problem with the Supreme Court implementing ethics. They just apparently did like in February or late last year or whatever. And you can always tell the good faith critics versus the bad faith critics in this. And there are a lot of bad faith critics who talk about behavior that happened prior to the ethics changes and say they violated the Supreme Court's ethics policies. Yeah, they violated the current policies, which did not exist when the supposedly outrageous thing happened. And look, I have no problem. Again, no problem. Supreme Court can set, probably should set for appearances' sakes, for vibes' sakes, some good, clear ethics policies, and it looks like they're doing that. I mean, I haven't studied this closely, but I do think that this stuff, starting with the Clarence Thomas and Harlan Crow stuff, and then the ridiculous attack on Gorsuch, which proved to be utterly meritless, and and revealing of the intent behind people who brought it, to this latest thing with Alito. I think there are a lot of people on the left. I don't think it's all a giant conspiracy, but it's one of these things that, like, H.G. Wells would call it an open conspiracy. There are a bunch of people on the left who now hate the Supreme Court because it's not theirs. And they are trying very hard to delegitimize the Supreme Court. The whole argument of court packing was an argument that the Supreme Court was illegitimate. A lot of the attacks on, and you can see how this is really an ideological thing from the left, insofar as there are a lot of conflicts of interest. There were examples of liberal justices like Breyer flying on private jets. At least that was disclosed, in fairness, but like, the Harvard case, which could come out while we're talking, I guess, or at least this week. Elena Kagan and Justice Jackson, they have like real conflicts with Harvard stuff, and the left doesn't care because they're going to rule the way they want them to rule. And this Alito thing, I'm not as convinced as Sarah and David are that it was bad for him to write that Wall Street Journal pre-buttal thing. But at the same time, I think the idea that somehow he is selling votes for a seat on a private jet is just nonsense. I mean, it's just straight up. Like, if you want to have an argument about how it looks bad, we can have that argument, and you can think it looks really bad, and I can think it looks but I can understand why you might think it looks bad. But like, if you actually think that, like, but for Clarence Thomas going on Harlan Crow's boat, he would have voted like a liberal, then you really just don't know anything about Clarence Thomas, or for that matter, Harlan Crow, but you can be forgiven for not knowing a lot about Harlan, who again is a friend of mine. I've been on that boat. I would love to go on that boat again. I make no apologies for it. I think Harlan is one of the best men I know. He's a profoundly decent man. You are free to think I'm as biased as you want to think I'm biased, but that's my honest opinion. And there's nobody who knows me who's heard me talk about Harlan Crow who hasn't heard me say that in private for years. I think he's a wonderful guy. Don't know Clarence Thomas very well, but I know a lot of people who know Clarence Thomas. And if you think that he's for sale, then you're just going with a cartoon version of the guy. Now, I got lots of credit, which is an awkward thing for me because he's so close to Harlan, and I like Clarence Thomas, and I have lots of friends who are close with Clarence Thomas. I think the way Ginny Thomas has behaved has been indefensible. I think it's been ethically indefensible. I think it's been ideologically indefensible. I think it's been factually indefensible. Her support for all the Trumpy nonsense is garbage. And I think it's obviously garbage. I just don't think it has profoundly or even remotely influenced the jurisprudence of Clarence Thomas. It's unseemly. I can't pierce the shroud of their marriage about whether it makes him mad or not. I have no freaking clue. But it is what it is. But if you go back and you look at the Alito thing, and Sarah and David do a very good job of explaining why a lot of this is in bad faith. When you go before the court, the petitioners are supposed to fill out forms about their conflicts of interest, all of that kind of stuff. The justices and their staffs are supposed to go with the information provided to figure out whether there's a meaningful conflict that might cause recusal or any of that kind of stuff. If that stuff is not presented, the presumption of a lot of this ProPublica nonsense is that that Alito, who hears thousands of certiorari cases, petitions a year, he should go Googling around and find out what some hedge fund owns and whether or not it conflicts with this thing that because he went on a fishing trip, 12 years ago or whatever. And it's nonsense. And I think it's dangerous, and it's particularly hypocritical. Again, I think there are a lot of people who are just sort of caught up. They just hear this stuff on the news. They know they don't like the conservatives on the court, and they just get caught up in Rachel Maddow's enthusiasm or Chris Hayes's enthusiasm, and they don't stop and think, and they just believe what their people are telling them, that the court is corrupt and that these guys are bought and paid for by billionaires, and they don't use a lot of critical faculties and all the rest. I don't think that they think that they're trying to undermine the court. But back in some back room, there are a bunch of people, and I've had conversations with people in green rooms at like CNN of lefties who talk about how much they hate the Supreme Court and how they think it has too much power, which I love hearing because I've been saying this for a very, 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 very long time. They only don't like that the Supreme Court has power because it doesn't have power to do the stuff they want anymore. They never questioned its legitimacy. When it did stuff it didn't have power to do. And now that it's basically sending a lot of powers back to state legislatures and to the people or to Congress, they think that's judicial activism and usurping power when in fact it is restoring power. So I have a deep philosophical problem with it. But somewhere in the back room, there are a bunch of people who are freaking out that the Supreme Court isn't theirs anymore. And they think that makes it fair game, particularly if you can just attack the conservative justices. I will have a lot more respect for ProPublica and its methods and its argumentation when they start doing this to some liberal justices. Because it is entirely possible that, I can't prove a negative. I don't know how many sort of unethical things or apparently unethical things the liberal justices have done. But given how shoddy and sort of how shoddy and cheap and sort of guilt by association and false a lot of the shots on the conservative justices have been from ProPublica and these people, I assume you can do a lot of that kind of thing to the liberal justices too, right? And that you can still be undermining the legitimacy of the court, but at least you're doing it in a bipartisan way instead of this sort of crappy partisan way. So I just don't have a lot of patience with the story. I think these guys overshoot. I think and the hypocrisy of spending all this time making arguments that I've made about the crisis of institutions, the crisis of norms, the breakdown of the legitimacy of important institutions, and then do this stuff towards the Supreme Court because you don't like its rulings, is profoundly hypocritical. And it smacks of that whole mindset, free speech for me, but not for thee. There are a lot of these people who love norms and institutions when they ratify their ideological desires. The real test of whether or not you actually believe in liberal democratic democracy, liberal democratic capitalism, is whether you have any degree of tolerance for decisions that don't go your way. And that's just lacking both on the integralist right and on the sophisticated left these days.
I thought this was quite an interesting question. The listener asks, how does the current polarized political environment in America compare to other historical periods of intense ideological division? Are there any particular historical moments that offer valuable insights for navigating today's political environment?
It's a great question. So, some context. For years, I wrote columns poo-pooing this, we're so divided stuff, right? And my spiel, democracy is about disagreement. People tend to decry political division when they're losing an argument. I grew up in the 1980s and 90s where the most sophisticated indictment of Ronald Reagan was that he used quote unquote wedge issues. And a wedge issue is an issue that, divides. I mean, it depends whose definition you want to use. If you use like the William Safire definition from the political dictionary, I mean, obviously I don't have it memorized, but it's an issue that divides your opponent's coalition, right? And it doesn't have to divide it evenly. If like gay marriage, George W. Bush used it as an issue because it largely unified his own coalition, but it split off like 10 or 20% of the Democratic coalition who were sort of conservative on the issue. Guns do this sometimes. Abortion, depending on how you frame it, can do it to both Republicans or Democrats, right? It would, like, late-term abortion is a wedge issue against Democrats. Abortion or birth control pills or morning after pills is a wedge issue against Republicans. And I never to this day understood what was wrong with wedge issues. I mean, I just don't get it. This is one of these things that Wattenberg kind of convinced me on. I just don't understand. I mean, I literally, people have explained it to me a lot, and I'm like Tom Hanks in Big when they're explaining that the buildings turn into robots, and I'm just like, I don't get it. I thought that's what politics was about, is taking issues that attract some of the other coalition's voters to your coalition. I thought, like, I mean, I don't know if it was Aristotle or Tommy Lee Jones who first said it, but like, it's like a thing, right? And I just don't understand why it was so outrageous, except if you think about how liberals in the 1980s why they hated Reagan, how they believed that the monopoly the Democratic Party had on Congress for so long was like a birthright, and it's outrageous to come up with issues that might threaten Democratic hegemonic control of anything, right? And so, anyway, that's a long-winded dodge to the actual question, except to say that I used to make these arguments all the time. Division is fine, disagreement is fine. I don't make those arguments the same way anymore because things, I think, have changed. And I think part of what's changed is the negative polarization stuff. Part of it is the big sort stuff. Part of it is the way in which the parties have now become virtually synonymous with an ideological label, which was not a thing for most of American history. I mean, yeah, the Republican Party had one set of issues and the Democratic Party had another set of issues, but they were issues. And particularly the Democratic Party, they didn't have a coherent ideological framework that united all of those issues, right? I mean, the FDR coalition had hardcore racist segregationists and blacks and Jews and communists in it. I mean, that's a diverse coalition. And the FDR approach was back scratching, you help me, I help you kind of popular frontism. And that LBJ coalition has been disintegrating for a long time. And, again, when I came to Washington, you still had to basically ask people kind of a follow-up question. If you asked them if they were Republican or Democrat, you still didn't necessarily know whether they were liberal or conservative. That's gone, right? So that's a big part of the change. And I think that this tendency to use partisan affiliation as almost a form of religious affiliation is dangerous and bad. And so there are a lot of ways in which I think things have gotten bad. That said, I think some of the points I used to make when I was saying don't get too bent out of shape about division still hold. The 1930s, Democrat or liberals of a certain bent are incredibly nostalgic for the 1930s, for the FDR and the New Deal, and we're all in it together, and the Works Progress Administration, and the arts this, and the Hoover Dam that, and yada, yada, yada. And they leave out that, like, it was one of the most violent periods of labor strife in American history. It was, you had legit sort of fascist movements domestically that were growing up. Um, um, you had just also you had a lot of people who were like hungry and in the street because the economy didn't work, right? I mean, it's not a time to be nostalgic for. Which is now I have something I have to say to people on the right as often as I have to say to people on the left. Similarly, like it's funny, the people, the sort of a lot of Democrats and liberals of a certain generation, the sort of baby boomers, are super nostalgic about the 1960s. And the 1960s sucked. And I'm not talking about because Herbert Marcuse went around, whooping and stomping, raping the cattle and killing the women or whatever. I'm talking about like the fact that like crime started to skyrocket. You had mass race riots. You had, I just wrote about this in my column about nostalgia the other day. There was an 18-month period from like 71 to 72 where there were 5 domestic bombings per day in the United States. You had a spokesman for the FBI described San Francisco in 1976 as the Belfast of North America. But what people are nostalgic for was the idea that basically liberals were winning all the political battles. And so they think that meant everybody was unified, and they weren't. No one's nostalgic for that. Well, I shouldn't say that. Only jackasses are nostalgic for the 1850s or the 1860s, right? But clearly we were more divided then. And I think what's different now has to do with technology, the decline of religion, it's a point that no one ever wants to hear from me for some reason, but I think it's an important one. Social media and mass media, these are nationalizing forces because they make the whole country, they pull the whole country together into a sort of monoculture. Monocultures are bad. And when I say monoculture, I don't mean, I should take it back, right? I don't mean monoculture the way a lot of people mean monoculture, where everybody believes the same thing. I believe what I'm talking about monoculture through social media and mass media is that people are responding to events in California. People in California are responding to events in New York as if they're happening in California. That everybody's all up in each other's grill and getting angry that people are living wrong thousands of miles away. And I think that's what's really bad about this sort of knitting together everything through technology. And so I honestly don't know what a great historical parallel moment to the problems that we have today are, because you pick the moment that comes to mind, and I see as many problems with it as I see similarities. And I just don't, I don't have a great answer for like, oh yeah, this is like the 1890s because X. Because I don't think it's like the 1890s. And the 1890s weren't that bad. And the things that I think are making things worse right now didn't exist in the way that they did back then. So it's kind of hard to say.
Should we do quick fire personal pop culture stuff to wrap up?
Sure. I mean, we can also trim the front of this a little bit because I think some of it will annoy people. But yeah, let's do it.
I'm hoping that all of it will.
Yeah. Sure. Do whatever you want.
Favorite venue for enjoying a cigar?
That is an excellent question. Probably some sort of, I mean, I can give you specific places, but like a porch, slightly cold weather, not cold, but not hot. You don't want to sit and sweat, right? In like the Adirondacks and that kind of thing. So that if you have a fire nearby, I think that's sort of perfect, maybe even with other people around. I'm not sure about
that. You're ordering a pizza just for you. What toppings do you go with?
If it's just for me, I mean, this is this is a little complicated because you're not married. When you're married or when you have kids, you may get toppings for a pizza, not because they're your favorite toppings, but they're the toppings you're never allowed to get when you have to share pizza with other people.
And you can't eat a 16-inch stuffed crust in your underwear anymore on the couch.
That's true.
You can't when you're not married.
I eat much less. We make whenever we have pizza, we make our own basically. But and when I say we, I mean my wife. But I would say it would be something on the order of sausage and pepperoni with hot peppers.
What sitcom would you want to have on your iPad on a deserted island?
Sitcom. Probably. I can just have one sitcom.
According to the listener.
Well, you got to pick something that has a lot of seasons, right? Because you don't know how long you're gonna be on this stupid friggin' island. I guess Cheers, because there's a lot of seasons. I'm trying to think. Not MASH. I'd break the iPad. Maybe Barney Miller. There were a lot of seasons of that. If I could only have one season of a sitcom, right? So like I'm gonna have to watch it a bunch of them. Probably the first season of 30 Rock.
What would you love to write about but don't?
Oh, so many things. First of all, I've said this many times. I would like to write a novel. I have some ideas for like sci-fi kind of novels that I would love to do, and one day I still may. I don't know. I've been on a pretty big philosophical kick of late for some specific reasons. I'd love to write more like deeply about philosophical stuff if I had the time to do it right. It's very difficult to like write a G file, in 3 hours on a really complex topic. But I'm finding myself more interested in philosophy stuff. I'm also much more interested in history stuff than I'm on an egghead kick of late. I'd also like to do more sort of fun reporting where I go and actually visit a place and like soak it in and write about it. But that's just logistically and schedule wise is hard. I also can't go like undercover to some place. Like I go undercover a lot of places. Most people don't have any friggin' clue who I am, but like I couldn't do anything in the sort of jackass right world without being spotted in the lobby pretty quickly. And I would have liked to have done some of that kind of stuff. But on specific topics, there aren't a lot of topics that I'm dying to write about, but they're just too hot to write about. I mean, if I was giving in, like one of the things I've said this many times, one of the muses, sources of inspiration is like being annoyed by stuff. Because it wants you to make an argument. There's the old George Will thing. And if I was giving into the stuff that sort of annoyed me, I'd probably write a lot more about the transgender stuff than I do. But I just don't know that it's necessarily a beat that needs me at this moment. And I write about it enough as it is.
What are some essential movies and books that you think everyone should watch and read before they turn 30?
Jeepers. People always ask me these eternal questions.
That's why I picked it, because I know they annoy you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll put it this way. Paul Johnson's Modern Times had a huge influence on me. It was really a very useful book. I read it before I was 30. I think people should read one of Irving Kristol's books. They're all very easy. They're short essays. I mean, they're not all very easy. Some of them are heady, but like it's not like because they're essays. He always called himself a middle distance runner. they're indigestible pieces. If you, the Daniel Boorstin Reader, I actually think would be really good for a lot of people in their 30, before they're 30, insofar as when you read Daniel Boorstin, particularly like the Americans series, you realize how much history you don't know. And like the Modern Times thing, it's a great book. It's a great contextualizer, particularly if you were a Cold War kid, anti-communist kid. But no book is going to like equip you to like have mastery over history or anything. The trick is to start reading stuff early enough to realize that what you really want to do is figure out the right questions, not the dispositive answers. And Boorstin touches on so many different cool things, and he's such a clear writer that it at least illuminates a whole bunch of unknowns for you in a way that I think would be really useful for people who are curious. Because like, it's sort of like the stuff that Virginia Postrel does. Unless you're exposed to it, it wouldn't occur to you to think about how interesting the history of fabric making is, right? And what Boorstin does is he really cares a lot about like the role of technology in shaping culture, and that gets you out of the memorizing the order of the presidents kind of thing, and instead thinking about how diverse and complex and nuanced American culture is and American histories and sort of history in general. I mean, I remember reading an essay by him in my early 20s about how St. Augustine broke the wheel of history. And the argument was that prior to St. Augustine, our conception of, when I say our, I mean Western, whatever, conception of history was like this cycles thing, right? Where you have ascendant cultures, golden ages, descendant, and then decay, and then destruction, and go around and around and around and around. And St. Augustine, after the fall of Rome, makes this argument where he says, well, wait a second, hold on. So it's sort of like, I can't believe I went through the whole Brett Devereaux thing talking about Rome without referencing Monty Python once. But it's sort of like the Monty Python Life of Brian thing where, what have the Romans ever done for us? Okay, well, except for, sewers, roads, and like they list all the things that the Romans do. St. Augustine, makes this argument that, wait a second, look, we're not heading back into some primordial dark place because we've made so much progress over the last few centuries in terms of all these technical things that we've figured out how to do. And I'm giving it short shrift. It's more, it's St. Augustine, so it's, St. Augustine, and it's Daniel Boorstin, so it's Daniel Boorstin. But like, that's the gist of it. And that put in my head, as much as anything else did, a way to think about history that I've always held on to. And you can see it layered into things like Suicide of the West. And so I think your 20s for reading, or your late teens through your 20s for reading, that's less of a time to search for answers and more of a time to search for good questions. In terms of movies, everyone should see Lawrence of Arabia. Everyone should see The Godfather. Everyone should see Chinatown. Everyone should see Dr. Strangelove. You should go through the AFI list. Like, I couldn't believe it when we first started the Dispatch. We had this little round robin conversation where Sarah, David, Steve, and I, we talked about the AFI top 100 movies or whatever. And I was stunned. I mean, I hadn't seen all of them. I think I'd only seen like 92 of them. I was stunned that like David was in the low teens or something.
Really?
Yeah. And Sarah was better, I think, but not a lot better. I can't remember what Steve was. I think his response is, what's a movie?
What's number one now? Is it Citizen Kane still, or has it changed?
It might be Godfather. I'm not sure. Might be Maltese Falcon. I don't love Citizen Kane, to be honest. I've had to talk about it a lot with my daughter because she's like this film classics double major these days, or looks like she's going to be. And the problem with Citizen Kane is that it's a little bit like, it's unfair to the Beatles, but like, because I think the Beatles are still merit listening to, but so much of the innovation has become conventional that it's invisible to you. And like, you need to sit there with somebody who says, oh my gosh, that was the first time that shot was ever used, or that's the first time they ever did something like that, or you see what they did by they're reversing the thing, that kind of thing. If you're not a film buff who is sort of looking at the how the sausage got made, I just don't think it's that compelling a movie compared to Maltese Falcon is still great. Casablanca, if you haven't seen Casablanca, watch Casablanca. And unlike a lot of these old movies, the pacing of Casablanca does not feel super slow. There are a lot of movies that, like, you can see why young kids can't handle watching them, without looking at their phone, because just the pacing is, there's a little of that with Lawrence of Arabia, which is why if you can see it on a big screen, you should, but you should see Lawrence of Arabia. So there's just, I don't know, there's just a lot of movies that everyone should see. And two movies. You should see Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, and you should see Face in the Crowd, which I still think is arguably the best single movie ever done, dealing with sort of the politics of populism and mass communication. Elie Kazan was a genius. Andy Griffith as a sort of populist villain is brilliant. Walter Matthau is Walter Matthau, who I love. And also, if you're on this weird kick, like, to bring this full circle back to the nostalgia stuff, there's that poll I wrote about where people think things were better 50 years ago. Go watch Network. Network, I think, is a brilliant friggin' movie. It's weird for me because it's like so much of it is shot in, like, some of it's like literally shot in my neighborhood growing up. Like, one of the funerals is at the synagogue where I went to grade school. And but it's pre-cable, right? It's pre-internet by in terms of even people's imaginings. And yet all of the kind of conversations we have about the circus atmosphere of broadcast television, or of television and cable television, Tucker Carlson and OAN, all of those themes are in it. It really gives you a sense of how the issues that we think are brand new and super scary and that we get all obsessed by are perennial issues in a democracy. And certainly in an era of mass communication, definitely worth watching.
A related question, listener asks, which mainstream movies are the best at unknowingly supporting or advancing conservative values and positions?
So it's funny you say that. I can't remember where I was talking about A Simple Plan, but because there's some movie out recently that someone was saying why it's a conservative movie, and I was like, it's like A Simple Plan. Can't remember who I was talking. Does this ring a bell? Did I do this on a podcast that you listen to?
Not really, no.
Okay, so like A Simple Plan.
Unless it was on Glop and I missed it.
Yeah, it's possible. A Simple Plan is this Bill Paxton movie. I really liked it. I remember writing for National Review that it was the most conservative movie of the 1990s. I won't give away all the spoilers or anything like that, but the basic gist of it is that these guys find a bunch of money, very common plot feature, right? And they convince themselves that it's a real simple plan to keep the money. And Billy Bob Thornton, who plays Bob Paxton's brother, this is in the trailer, I believe, so like people can not worry about it too much. Bill Paxton is like, we can't do this. We have to turn it into the cops. And Billy Bob Thornton says, what are you talking about? This is the American dream. And Paxton says, you work for the American dream. It's not, you don't find the American dream. And then Billy Bob Thornton says, well, this is better. And things go badly. And this sort of gets to like this. I talked about this at the end of the Acton Institute podcast I did on the Deneen book. One way to think about life and also about civilization, and sort of a running theme in Suicide of the West as well, is that the real state of nature is a jungle, right? I know it's not just a jungle, there are also savannas and whatever, and temperate zones, whatever. But the real state of nature is like a jungle, and civilization is like a garden that you make, where you clear out the jungle and you grow stuff, you cultivate stuff. Culture comes from the same root as cultivate, right? You cultivate something special that needs your attention. That's why gratitude is so important, all that. And if you don't tend to it, the jungle grows back. It takes it back. Horace says, you can chase nature out with a pitchfork. It'll always come rushing back in, right? This is my thing. And a simple way to think about it also is that if you want to add a time element to it, civilization is like a path cut out of the jungle, out of the wilderness, if you prefer. And we've learned some rules about how to stay on the path. It's this bourgeois morality stuff that I keep harping on. It's doing the right thing. It's thinking about your integrity and your character, and being other oriented towards the people who matter to you, and protecting, basic rights. You can go as long as you like about these things. And the great temptation is to think that there's a simple plan to sort of to cut a corner, to have a switchback, to like head them off at the pass, to leave the path and take a shortcut. And that's what the integralists and authoritarian guys on the right are constantly arguing about doing. And that's what the left has been arguing about doing with technocracy or socialism or communism, all these kinds of things. They think that like they take these lessons for granted. It's Chesterton's fence and all that stuff. And the great thing about a simple plan is like, it's a great small example of how a decent person leaves the path just also ever so briefly, and bad things happen. More broadly, I've made this argument for years. Anytime abortion comes up on a normal mainstream sitcom, it ends up being a right-wing message, or it ends up being a pro-life message, because you're not going to write a character who gets pregnant and then have them have an abortion, right? So you're always going to have them ultimately decide. I mean, yeah, they've tried some really fringe things with abortion stuff. It doesn't play with normal, average Americans, whether they're pro-choice or pro-life. People don't want, abortions are a downer. And so it's amazing. It's how, like, Rachel decides she's going to keep her baby or whatever. And the second she decides to keep it, even though we've got like a whole season to go, like weeks and weeks of episodes, she talks about the baby as if it's a fully formed human being, and I'll do everything I can to protect the baby. And on Big Bang Theory, when Bernadette gets pregnant, Howie says, "Oh my gosh, or maybe it's Raj, whatever." But one of them says, "Oh my gosh, you made a person." Right. And it's just like, but she's instantaneously pregnant,
You made a cluster of cells.
Right.
The original line.
You created novel uterine contents is not a thing you say on a sitcom, right? I think most Law and Order cop shows are basically conservative. In the sense that, there are clear-cut good guys and bad guys. And like, sure, in the sort of Foxified world, you're supposed to defend cops even when they're bad. But for most normal conservatives, corrupt cops are bad guys, right? And so, like, with this sort of just general reinforcement of normal norms and notions of morality, I think come through in a lot of that kind of stuff. I generally think the pop culture, I'm not going to do this Paul Cantor thing at AI, in a couple of weeks. I think pop culture has a lot more conservative stuff than people realize, because we so are attuned to dumb definitions of right and left and conservative and progressive and all that kind of stuff, that we kind of miss it. Also, most people don't know any history. So like, I think it's hilarious. I love The Americans on FX. I thought it was a great show, right? That show, if you tried to make that show in the 70s, Noam Chomsky would come to your house and shoot out your porch light. I mean, like, it was like, it took as a given that prominent members of black power groups were basically communist agents helping the Soviet Union undermine the United States of America. It took it as a given that a bunch of intellectuals were really useful idiots or communist or outright communist agents, that the communists had infiltrated large parts of it. Basically, it was saying all of your McCarthyite paranoia would have been right if you knew what was going on. And it was amazing to me how vast swaths of the left just thought it was awesome. Like, we must have run like 3 or 4 pieces at National Review, either corner posts or whatever, expressing our dread about what this show was going to be like. And it turned out we loved it because it was just ratifying of the Cold War. Or it was ratifying it was like more extreme in some ways than like the Bill Buckley point of view, and which I just thought was kind of great. And I think that this is one of the things that gets into, it's very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible. Hannibal Lecter is a good example, but it's very difficult to make popular pop culture fare where you are not upholding some basic bourgeois norms of morality. You can do it at the margins. You have to sort of go kind of dystopian or overturn a lot of things. You can make Omar into a hero in The Wire, even though he's just a simply, he's a very sophisticated one, but he's a murderer. He's a murderer who mostly murders other drug dealers. You can have Byronic kind of heroes from here to there, but like whenever you sort of look past the surface, it turns out that the proof that you're supposed to like these guys is that they're good to their families, right? Or that they, want better for their kids or whatever. Breaking Bad's a complicated example of that, but for the most part, this is a good and decent country, and good and decent people don't want to see bad people turned into heroes. And the only way you can really turn bad people into heroes is by having even worse people be the villains. Cantor used to make a point, which I think is very good. There are other things that only seem conservative if you're doing it as a comparative cross-cultural thing, right? That if it's like that exposes the way like Americans respond to certain things versus the way, say, Swedes or French people would. And so like, I remember him talking about how Walking Dead was very American, very sort of conservative in a small c pragmatic sense about, the American tendency towards problem solving and pragmatism and all these kinds of things. And I think some of those kinds of analyses are kind of fun. But anyway, I think I have a lot more answers to this question, but I think I should now probably stop.
Well, I mean, at least that took us to a fairly optimistic note to end on.
Yeah, I guess so.
Faith in the American people through
fighting zombies.
Where did that? Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So thank you, Guy, for doing this on short notice. Not like you really had a choice. And
it's not like the result was really anything to...
That's true. I mean,
anything people should experience.
Again, I highly recommend people go back and re-listen to the Brett Devereaux one. I will say I think I've only done this once when it wasn't because my wife and I were in the car. Like, I never re-listened to The Remnant. And the only times I've ever done it is like on long drives when my wife wanted to listen to it. So I listened to it again, that kind of thing. Except for I think it was the last time I had Yuval Levin on where we talked about Edmund Burke and the Birds of Prey stuff. I re-listened to that because I really wanted to rehear what Yuval had to say. But I think I have to go back and listen to the Robert Kagan one because with the benefit of hindsight, I more and more think he's wrong about the 1920s and the FDR's thing about return to normalcy, being fascist. I think it was very clear from our conversation. I think he's right about a lot of foreign policy stuff. But I think his analysis about, I liked his sort of, there are anti-liberal and pro-liberal aspects on both the left and the right, and I think he's right about that, obviously. But I keep hearing from people saying, I'm not sure I buy that, this, that, or the other thing, and I got to go back and actually listen closely to what he said and see what I actually think about it. So I'll try to do that. I just hate listening to myself. I know you feel the same way about listening to me. So with that,
I'm amazed your wife doesn't. I can't believe Jessica actually chooses to listen to the Remnant.
It's not often. It's really not often. And it really is guest dependent. And she literally thinks the ruminant is unhealthy.
We have that in common. Yeah.
Yeah. So, last thing I'll say, and then I got to get out of here. I had the pleasure of going to a wedding this week. I went to the wedding of Ezra and Ellie Troy. Tevi's son got married, and
is that right?
And it was, I'll be honest, a huge pain in the ass, because it was on a Monday night out near Baltimore. It's only the second Orthodox Jewish wedding I have been to, the first being Tevi's. And this one was pretty much more intense. But once there, it was a great event. It really was. It was truly joyous, and a lot of fun. And I saw some people that I haven't seen in a very long time. Tevi was on cloud 9 and pretty close to cloud 9 because the youngins were carrying him around on chairs and on their shoulders all over the place. It was really adorable. I saw Tevi's brothers, Dan and Gil, I haven't seen in a while. We go way back. And it was funny because a bunch of people, some I knew, some I didn't, would come up to me and talk to me about how they think it's their job to report to Tevi when I make fun of him on this podcast, when he's not on it. And so it turns out a lot of people get in touch with Tevi to give him grief about the grief I give him on this podcast, which I thought was kind of funny. And so, it's now a race. I'm going to wait for Tevi to tell me who's the first person to tell Tevi about hearing about me talk about him on this podcast. And we'll see what people say. And the problem is that it might be Tevi, but that wouldn't exclude other people from reaching out to him. But congratulations to all Troys. It was really a wonderful event, and I'm really glad we ended up going out.
But people interrupting the ceremony and to go up to him and say, "Hey, did you hear what Jonah said about you?"
No, but there's
listen to the Remnant right now.
There's a lot of audience participation at an Orthodox Jewish wedding that I was not aware of.
Is that right?
Yeah, and it was great fun. It was really great fun. I don't know a lot about that world. Jess was worried about the dress code for obvious reasons and all that kind of stuff, but it all worked out great. We didn't stay all that late because it was a Monday night and it was like an hour drive, but and Orthodox Jewish weddings go on for a long time. I think it was from late afternoon until about 11 o'clock at night. So anyway, congratulations to the entire Troy brood. And thanks for listening, and apologies for this regretful podcast. I'll see you next time.
No, you won't. This is still a podcast.
Shut up, guy.